Okay, so welcome everyone. I'm Arianna Piazzalunga and I'm doing my PhD at the University of Turin with Federico Petrucci. And I'm very glad to welcome you to this second meeting of the Schils devoted to Calcidius on Plato's Timaeus by Reydams-Schils. And by the way, we are very glad to have her here today with us. So the Shelf is a cycle of online book presentations organized by our research group, and especially Federico Petrucci, Giulia De Cesaris, and myself, with the Cambridge University Press. So let me show you the whole cycle of events. So today we are presenting Calcidius on Plato's Timaeus, while next time, April the 1st, the same time, we will present Christian Platonism, a history, edited by Alexander Hampton and John Kenny. And the book will be discussed by Christoph Rydberg and Enrico Pasini. While the following week, on April the 8th, always at 5 p.m., we will present the book Authority and Authoritative Texts in the Platonist Tradition, edited by Michael Erler, Jan Essler, and Federico Petrucci, and discussed by Mauro Bonazzi and Olga Alieva. And if you have missed our first meeting and you wish to watch it, you can find the record on our Facebook page and on our YouTube channel, Filosofia Antica Torino. And also, if you have not yet registered for the forthcoming event and you wish to do it, you can write an email to us at this address. Also, let me remind you that this event is recorded. And also, I'm glad to mention the fact that the Cambridge University Press will apply a discount of the 40% for these 4 books for those who have participated in these meetings. And for this, we thanks to the Cambridge University Press. You can write an email to Michael Sharp. You find the email in the chat. Now we will send it. And for today, so we are presenting Calcidius on Plato's Timaeus by Reydams-Schils. Needless to say, Reydams-Schils is a professor at the University of Notre Dame. Is professor within the program of liberal studies, and she's a fellow of the Medieval Institute. And her areas of specialization are Platonism and Stoicism. And among her publication, let me recall Demiurge and Providence, a Stoic and Platonist reading of Plato's Timaeus, 1999, and the Roman Stoics, Self, Responsibility, and Affection, 2005. And as to the book, Calcidius on Plato's Timaeus, it is the first monograph who assess in its entirety the importance of the philosophical importance of this commentary, and it shed a new light on this thinker, on Calcidius, also highlighting the originality of its thought. And it is divided in 3 parts. The first part is devoted to the structure of the commentary and to Calcidius as an authorial voice. The second part is a thematic survey of the main topics that the commentary deal with, and the third part is on Calcidius' sources, so Stoicism, the Stoics, Aristotle, and the Christian tradition. So for today, we will have a first discussion of the book by Christina Henning. She is associate professor at the University of Pittsburgh. And I would like to mention her important monograph, Plato's Timaeus in the Latin Tradition, 2018. And after her talk, we can have a discussion with the author and with the public. After that, we will take a small break. And afterwards, Federico Petrucci will discuss the book. Federico Petrucci is associate professor at the University of Turin, and he is also the organizer of this event. And I recall his monograph, Taurus of Beirut, the other side of Middle Platonism, 2018. And after that, of course, we will have a discussion again. So now I'm glad to introduce Christina. Christina, if you want to talk, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Arianna. Can everyone hear me okay? All right, thank you. All right, well, let me start by thanking our organizers once again for putting together this event series. And I'm really glad to see some of the faces I saw last week again today. So congratulations, Gretchen, for writing a monograph that should have been written a long time ago. And I'm not criticizing your time management. You've been very efficient. What I'm saying is that, you know, I'm very glad that Calcidius is finally getting the attention he should have gotten a long time ago. And as I read through Gretchen's very careful analysis of Calcidius's work, I kept having flashbacks to, you know, some very lonely times in the university library when it was just me and Weising's Latin edition of Calcidius, which is learned but accessible. It is not. So I just remember, you know, this feeling of profound helplessness, and comparisons with other commentators weren't always helpful because Calcidius, you know, he's a funny animal, for better or worse. And things, of course, much improved when Beatrice Pacouche's 2 volumes came out, and then, of course, more recently, John McGee's English translation. And then, in addition to those important works, I'm so happy that we now have this very useful guide. It's the How to Read Calcidius manual by Gretchen. So I'm not just excited for current scholars, I'm particularly excited for future students of Calcidius, for whom he's now so much more accessible. And I could not help but notice that what Gretchen says about Calcidius as a commentator applies to her as well. So let me quote from page 9 of her book. Commentators on philosophical texts in antiquity faced a double bind. They had to be careful not to diminish the reputation of the thinker whose work they were elucidating. Why, after all, would a text need a commentary if it were not because of inherent deficiencies? Second, they could not afford to insult the intelligence of their addressees, and through the addressees, that of their potential broader audience. So I think, obviously, Gretchen managed to produce a fine volume that's in itself a commentary on Calcidius, and that manages to insult neither him, unlike some older studies, nor as our Gretchen's addressees. So Arianna has already given you a very brief outline. So I had an outline prepared, but I'll just very briefly cover that so I can cut that short. You know, for those who haven't had the chance to look at the volume yet. And Fede actually has had a very brief chance to look at the volume. He says he only got it, the physical copy, 30 minutes ago, just perfect timing. So here, just very briefly, again, Gretchen presents her analysis in 3 parts. Part 1 discusses methodological concerns, so Calcidius' voice as an author, the way in which he guides us through Plato's dialogue, the structure of the commentary, which on closer analysis betrays the author's pedagogical agenda. Part 2 discusses key themes in the commentary: time and universe, human and cosmic soul, providence and fate, matter, being, and form. And part 3 addresses Calcidius' relationship with his sources, both direct and indirect. And Gretchen here, for example, reassesses the author's dependence on Porphyry and Numenius. And finally, she revisits the issue of Calcidius' Christian identity or otherwise in the final parts of the book. And to me, the structure brings out very beautifully what makes Calcidius an interesting figure. So singled out here are his independent voice and method, the nature of his own version of Platonism, and his at times very distinctive use of his source material. So I would like to follow Gretchen's structure more or less and pick out a couple of talking points. The first one concerns his Calcidius's pedagogical method, and the second one concerns his discussion of matter, one of the central points developed by him, which I will address in the context of some Christian material or not Christian material we find in his commentary. So I have a presentation on the stuff I want to say about matter in a little bit, but for now I'm just talking. So first, some comments on Calcidius's pedagogical method. Some of the idiosyncrasies in his commentary may be due to the fact that his intended audience was beginners, which, as Gretchen notes, was not the established practice of philosophical schools. So he expresses his contempt for arrogant specialists who refuse to share their knowledge. And this attitude, I think, also explains his twofold undertaking of producing a translation and a commentary. So Gretchen suggests that his entire approach might be aimed at forestalling Christian criticism against the exclusivist Platonic heteroi. So he sees himself as a mediator between Greek and Latin, as we know is witnessed by his translation, and as a mediator between Greek and Roman cultures and Christian and non-Christian readers. So again, as is witnessed by his commentary. So let me just point to some of the methods Calcidius uses to help his readers along on their journey. So for example, he uses explicitly temporal language in his translation of Timaeus' creation account, and then shows us in the commentary how to translate this language of temporality into language of causality. And then the translation itself is an exegetical translation. So Calcidius at times he greatly simplifies the text, and Gretchen notes that this is especially the case in the parts on the word soul, and he likely does so to make it more accessible to his readers. The structure of the commentary, Gretchen notes, is a sequential arrangement of topics. So each section reflects a step in the ascent towards theoretical knowledge, guiding readers from maths to physics to theology. And then he gives us a smart doxography. So his presentation of doxographical material shows a clear structure, logical progression, and arrangement of arguments and counter-arguments, and visible connections between individual headings. So overall, his methodology points to his independence from the Platonist commentary tradition, which leads me to stress something that Gretchen has brought out, in the extent of which I had not appreciated before, namely that we seem to be dealing with a formidably confident author. So he's quite happy, as Gretchen notes, to show many of Plato's successors, show them the cold shoulder or to give them the silent treatment. And in doing so, he manages to establish a more direct line between himself and Plato. All right, so this is where I share my screen. So hopefully things will not come crashing down. So I have a presentation. Okay. Finally, I can use PowerPoint's celestial theme. Okay, I would like to single out a couple of chapters in Calcidius' discussion of matter. So very briefly, Calcidius rejects the notion of created matter, which, as Gretchen points out, poses a challenge to any effort of assigning a Christian identity to him. For Calcidius, matter is uncreated, it is an independent cosmic principle. There's also no sign in Calcidius of this sort of layered theory of creation that we get in the Christian exegetical tradition, roughly from the 2nd century onwards, in which God first creates matter from nothing and then forms the cosmos from this created matter. So integrating the creatio ex nihilo with certain aspects of the craftsmanship of the Timaean demiurge who works with pre-existing matter. So I want to make a few comments on Gretchen's discussion of Origen's presence or not in chapters 276 through 8 of the commentary. So this, I believe, is section 15.4 in Gretchen's book. So as Gretchen notes, it has been proposed that Calcidius culled the entire section, those three chapters, from Origen's lost commentary on Genesis. So let's read through it, why don't we? So everyone can get a taste of Calcidius. So this is an abbreviated version. Can you see the whole text? Yeah. Okay, so I abbreviated it. This is John's English translation. The Hebrews think, chapters 276, that matter is generated. Moses, wisest among them, was quickened, they say, by divine inspiration rather than human eloquence. In the book known as The Generation of the World, he began by saying, according to the translation of 70 wise men, in the beginning, God made heaven and earth, but the earth was invisible and without order. And then Calcidius reports on the versions of the first lines of Genesis by Aquila, Symmachus, and what he thinks is Origen's version. And then he continues, nevertheless, they say that all of these versions converge in one respect, that the matter which underlies all corporeal reality was generated, and they interpret the actual words as follows. Beginning is not meant in the temporal sense. They then say that beginning has multiple significations, and then he lays out some possible meanings of the word beginning, and then continues. Sorry, 1 second. So there is nevertheless one beginning of all things, concerning which Solomon says in Proverbs, God created me as the pathway of his progression. He established me before the origin of the world, explicitly indicating that divine wisdom came before heaven and earth were made, and that the same divine wisdom was the primordial origin of the universe. And from this, it is clear that wisdom was indeed made by God, but not at any point in time, for there was no time when God was without wisdom. And this is how we should take the term beginning. And then let me just switch. So the next two chapters, I'm just summarizing. Chapter 277, Calcidius rejects a literal interpretation of the pair heaven and earth, first mentioned in Genesis. Chapter 278, he then gives us 3 additional possible interpretations of this primordial pair, heaven and earth, including one he attributes to Philo. And here, so I've taken this from Gretchen's book, the 4 possible interpretations of this pair, heaven and earth, what that might mean, that may refer to. He gives us in those 2 chapters, 277, 278. Now he attributes the second one, I believe, to Philo. So for Philo, the pair heaven and earth in the first verses of Genesis refers to intelligible paradigms for the physical creation. And then just to note here, the 4th possible interpretation brings up the idea of intelligible matter. So here, heaven would refer to intelligible matter and earth to sensible matter. But just a note that Calcidius himself, as Gretchen notes, does not use this idea of intelligible matter. He just lists it. Now, where am I going with this? So Gretchen's very interesting suggestion here is that these chapters, 3 chapters, which have been associated with Origen, include more traces of Philo than just the one view Calcidius attributes to him. So she challenges the notion of a complete dependence on Origen in these chapters and suggesting Philo as an alternative source here. So why Philo? Well, in the opening of chapter 276, So Calcidius says that the Hebrews, let me just go back, that the Hebrews considered matter to be generated, not temporally understood, but understood in terms of an ontological dependence on God. And then seemingly to explain this further, he then discusses the eternal relationship between God and wisdom. And for his phrase, there was no time when God was without wisdom, parallels in origin have been adduced that describe the relationship between Father and Christ. Now, as Gretchen notes, Calcidius' statement about God and wisdom does nothing to illuminate the status of matter. So some additional steps, she notes, in the argument may be missing, a step that Calcidius has skipped, one that ties wisdom to matter. And the parallels that have been adduced from origin only lay out the relationship between Father and Christ as well. They do nothing to illuminate the role of matter either. So Gretchen suggests that instead of origin, it may be useful to think of Philo here as the source behind the passage. And she names the parallels. So Philo in his De Ebrietate uses designations for matter we find in the Timaeus, namely foster mother or receptacle, to refer to episteme, to refer to knowledge. So Philo there suggests that episteme, knowledge as a feminine principle in relation to God, takes on a role that is analogous to matter. So in other words, Philo does tie wisdom or episteme knowledge to matter, which is that step we're looking for in Calcidius, but that seems to have fallen out. So there are further aspects to this, but I'm skipping that here. So very simply put, so a simplified upshot of all of this is that Gretchen very interestingly concludes that Calcidius' source, or suggests that Calcidius' source, perhaps Philo, could be drawing from an older Jewish wisdom tradition that predates Christianity. So this section of the commentary she suggests may give us an interpretation that does not have to contain specifically Christian views as distinct from views that were circulating also in Hellenistic Judaism. So it's suggested by the possibility that Philo is behind this passage here. So and I find this suggestion really intriguing. I thought it might be useful to throw in a bit of Augustine here, some passages from his Confessions, which I'm sure not only Gretchen is familiar with. So these chapters from Augustine's Confessions show parallels. So parallels have been detected in them to these three chapters we just looked at in Calcidius. So I just wanted to throw that into the mix. I think it's useful to look at Augustine here, even though he was writing in the early 5th century, and I think Gretchen's preferred dating for Calcidius is early 4th century. But I thought it might nevertheless be interesting to look at Augustine here, because that way we see what a quintessentially Christian interpretation of similar material looks like compared to that of Calcidius. And because I'd like to ask Gretchen if, and if so, how these parallels in Augustine complicate the situation for us. So what, if anything, might Augustine add, to this entangled affair between Calcidius, Philo, and Origen? So I have Augustine's passage here. It's Augustine, so it's wordy. Okay. So this is from his Confessions, 12:19, 28 to 12:20. So it is true, Lord, that you made heaven and earth, and it is true that your wisdom, in which you made all things, is the beginning. Likewise, it is true that this visible world consists of two vast sectors, namely heaven and earth, a phrase which succinctly embraces all the natural beings which have been formed and created. It is also true that everything that is mutable suggests to us the idea of a kind of shapelessness, out of which that thing can either take a shape or be changed and altered. It is true that anything that clings so closely to an unchanging form that it does not change, though it is capable of changing, is not subject to time of any kind. It is true that shapelessness, which is close to nothingness, cannot admit shifts in time either. I think I cut this bit out of the slide because it got too much. So I'm continuing here. It is true that any substance from which something is made can, in a figure of speech, take the name of the thing that emerges from it. Thus, that undefined shapelessness from which heaven and earth were made could itself be called heaven and earth. It is true that of all creatures that have some shape to them, none come closer to the shapelessness than the earth and the deep. It is true that you have not only made whatever has been created and given shape, but also what has the capacity to be created and take shape. For all things come to you. It is true that everything that takes shape after being without shape was shapeless first and shaped afterward. Chapter 20. As for all these truths, those on whom you have bestowed the ability to see with the inner eye have no doubts about them. They believe that Moses, your servant, spoke unshakably in a spirit of truth. So from all these truths, one person adopts a single interpretation by saying, in the beginning, God made heaven and earth. This means that in his word, which was co-eternal with himself, God fashioned a creation that was intellectual and sense perceptible, or spiritual and physical. So let me just summarize the parallels that have been detected between these chapters and Calcidius's 3 chapters from earlier. So Augustine also, he makes this move from generated heaven and earth to wisdom, the beginning. He then mentions the physical creation that is heaven and earth. And then we also see in Augustine this move from wisdom to matter. Matter here is the substrate, and he notes that it's also referred to as heaven and earth. We also get a reference to Moses, and we get what appears to be an allusion to intelligible created matter. So here in the second but last line and last line, it's a creation that was spiritual and physical. So Augustine's words here are the spiritualis, typo, creatura, which he uses to refer to intelligible matter, just like spiritualism and materia on some occasions. Augustine also, like Calcidius, in the remainder of his discussions, which I did not put on a slide because it is lengthy and complicated, Augustine also gives us a list of various interpretations of this pair, heaven and earth. He gives us more interpretations and they don't overlap neatly. And again, I didn't bring those along because I just want to flag this passage. I don't want to analyze it here. So my question to you, Gretchen, I'm sure obviously you've come across these chapters, so I was wondering what your thoughts on them are. Can we make anything useful of these parallels? And some studies to which you refer have discussed the possibility that based on the parallels in Augustine knew Origen. So here we'd go with this assumption that both Calcidius and Augustine were looking at Origen again. And it has also been asked whether Augustine knew Calcidius. I'm not sure what I think about that, so I would love to hear your ideas. Finally, as I said, one of the reasons why I brought along the Augustine passage is to give an example of what a quintessentially Christian interpretation of this material may look like, or does look like. And of course, with this kind of comparison, I'm not going for scholarly rigor. I'm just very casually pointing to the differences in pitch and method of argument. And I am, of course, entirely happy with your conclusion, Gretchen, that Calcidius himself wants to make the non-Christian philosophical tradition available to Christians, that he is targeting an audience that included Christians, but that he very clearly subordinates a Christian element to Plato's authority. And finally, Gretchen ends with the statement that I suspect she wrote only to be challenged. So she says that Calcidius was such an effective cultural mediator then that he ultimately managed to erase himself. Hard disagree, obviously. He did not manage to do that because you just put him back on the page. And that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina, for this very rich talk. Gretchen, please, would you like to answer?
Yes, I'll try to answer between my coughs, and I managed to get an ordinary cold, which you have to, it's a kind of accomplishment to do that in a lockdown. But rest assured, it's not COVID. But if my voice sounds a little bit weird, that's why. Christina, first of all, thank you so much for a lovely presentation. What I will say also, what is behind this book is an unusual rich collaboration between scholars. And I think, we managed to give each other extra momentum while doing that. So, Christina was working on her book in the Timaeus in the Latin tradition. Just as a time when I was, some of my ideas were gelling. Beatrice Bacush's, translation with notes came out. Of course, we drew on earlier work from Anna Somfai, and then Jean McGee entered the picture. And it's very common in academic environments to see people trying to elbow each other out of the way, or at least I'm very used to this in an Anglo-American setting. But that didn't happen here at all. I mean, I think we created space for each other's work, and the momentum that was generated by that was quite lovely. And again, we each have our own perspectives. We have things on which we disagree. But we gave each other the space to do that, because it will enrich the scholarly debate. So let me briefly turn to the parallels, very interesting parallels with Augustine. So let me start with a practical question. Did Augustine know Calcidius? Well, people have indicated that probably not, because when he refers to the Timaeus, he seems to be relying on Cicero's translation rather than Calcidius's. So that's kind of an issue right there. I mean, maybe he used a commentary and not a translation. I mean, but anyway, the translation seems to be more Cicero's version. Now, on the parallels, I think in the end, say that they probably go back to similar material, whether it's origin or another source. So what are the elements that are missing? The differences, the key differences. And again, this is just from memory and briefly with the summary that Christina has given. So if you go to the end, maybe you can call it up again, Christina. If you go to the last passage you cited, from Augustine, yeah, I mean here, this means that in his word, which was co-eternal with himself, God fashioned a creation that was intellectual and sense perceptible. So as in origin, in his word, this is the relationship between the first person of the Trinity and the second person of the Trinity. This is Christ. And what I am missing here is the association between wisdom and matter, which is really what we would need for the argument to work. And if I may make a small maybe a small nuance, it's not necessarily the case that Calcilius skipped a step, but it is lapidary in the sense that we can only follow his argument if we presume that he was relying on a connection between wisdom and matter, because otherwise the entire passage is irrelevant. I mean, after all, we're talking about a relationship between God and matter being generated as being dependent on God. So we need to find a connection. Now, in Tertullian, there is a claim about, I think it's Christ being the matter of matters. So there is a passage in Tertullian that people have brought into the picture. But I think even that one, if Tertullian's view, relies on some kind of older connection between wisdom as a feminine principle and matter. So yeah, the parallels are, I mean, they clearly are drawn from similar material. But one of the things that is also different is the specific translation of origin of that line of Genesis. where he says that Earth was in some kind of stupid admiration. And then later on, Calcilius ends up glossing that as referring to some kind of irrational lower world soul, which actually would bring us back possibly to Numenius's view. So anyway, yeah, but the parallels are real. They're very, very suggestive, very evocative, but I still think that the general gist of the way it's being used and the purpose to which it's put is different. And of course, you know, that passage is so complicated. You probably have a better sense. That whole section is so complicated, but Augustine would not accept that matter in any sense is independent, is an independent principle. But that would be less relevant for this section, because in this section, of course, matter is considered dependent on God, because that is the view of the Hebrews. So maybe you yourself can take it a bit further, but that's where I would go prima facie, because you included Augustine in your book on the Latin tradition, right?
I did, yes, but I was one of those sheep who simply went along with, oh, there's origin behind this passage, a shared source, you know, which was the prevailing view at the time. And it did not occur to me to challenge that. So I was extremely excited to find this in your book. And I thought, oh, what will Gretchen do with Augustine here? But I find your answer very, very satisfying. I think it's just, you know, they drew from some common pool of, you know, exegetical strategies, exegetical views, and then they both did their very own thing with it, you know. So what I find it's very interesting is that Calcidius gives us these different interpretations of heaven and earth, and then singles out what he thinks is right, and then Augustine says, these are all truths, you know, and then you can combine them all, you know, in this phrase heaven and earth. And I think it's very typically, it's such a beautiful comparison of these very different strategies you get here. On the actual contents of Augustine's interpretation, I have to admit, I find them incredibly complicated. What comes up, you know, in the passages that I very conveniently cut out. No, this would take us too far today. I cannot comment on those. So, because I mean, he does make more of the notion of intelligible matter here. So, and I think that's a very central thing that he develops. So here's another difference here. Between the two authors. Other than that, I have nothing more illuminating to say that would go beyond what you've already observed. But I'm very happy that you pointed to the differences, because I was hoping you would give me some balance out my my presentation there. So thank you very much.
Yeah, if I remember correctly, then Augustine also has the notion of the cosmos noetos, which of course, you know, becomes an important element in the tradition. Yeah. But I've read those passages of Augustine over and over and over again, trying to make sense of them. So, yeah. But you know, it's Charlotte Kirkert who made the strongest argument, and it's a very good argument, even though I disagree with it. On all the chapters, depending on all of them, you know, the entire section depending on origin. And then she also points out two parallels, you know, different meanings of heaven and earth, but they're not the same. And then once we start talking about the Origins Lost Commentary on Genesis, we're sort of, you know, at sea. So even there, the parallels with origin are not with what we have, are not matching perfectly, you know, in the different interpretations of heaven and earth.
May I add a quick follow-up on this? I mean, it is rather a methodological follow-up, and I think this is a principle which Gretchen uses very well in her book. I mean, this idea of a dependence on an author upon another, I think one could conceive it in philological terms. I mean, if you find a passage which you can ascribe to more than one author, even though you cannot find really it in these writings, then you don't have any proof that there is a direct dependence. I mean, you can just prove what is mistaken, so errors in theological terms, things which you cannot find anywhere else than in that passage. And I think it works, especially in a world made of books, such as antiquity was. And this is a perfect case study for this, indeed.
Yeah, and this is particularly important for the parallels that have been noted with Porphyry and the Neoplatonists. And Jones already pointed this out. I think, is it 1910 or 1917? He pointed out in an article that, just because you have parallels doesn't mean, like the point you just made, Federico, of dependence, because they could both be going back to earlier sources. And which is in effect, these are the ideas of sort of an earlier layer of Platonism that resurface in these later texts, but you can't make a dependence argument unless you have notions that are really, really specific to a given author.
If there are further questions or comment on this, I invite you to raise your hand. Sebastian Moro, please.
Hello, thank you very much and congratulations for the book and for the presentations. I was wondering about why heaven represents matter and earth. Wouldn't be earth the feminine principle because it's the mother earth or something like that? And is it related with Pythagorean notions of monads and deias, the indefinition and the fineness? That was my question.
There's only one of the four interpretations that associates heaven with matter, and then with intelligible matter, and then earth with sensible matter. The others don't do that. The Pythagorean principles are not very strong in Calcidius's analysis. They do show up in the first part of the commentary that is devoted to mathematics. So he has a couple of passages where he talks about a monad and a dyad, but it's not something that he systematically takes along, and that becomes a focal point in his kind of Platonism. And then, as Christina has also said, this is really the only context in which the notion of intelligible matter comes up. And it's sort of, it comes up because you're going through a list of possibilities. It's like a doxographical progression. You can map it out. This was one of the possibilities that was left. But he doesn't, the notion of intelligible matter does not play a prominent role in his own views.
Very interesting. And can I ask about the other repercussions? Is this second category of the wisdom, can it be related with Scotus Erugena, the second movement of the nature that is created and creates? It's like the world of ideas in wisdom.
Right. It's in that context that, I can't really say much about any possible parallels with Erugena. I don't have Erugena at my fingertips, whereas you do, I suspect. But what might be worth mentioning too is that this is the context where he talks about God making the matter that he needs for creation. And it's a view which he rejects. So that's a really important turning point in the progress of the argumentation.
Thank you.
Please, Svetoslava Slaveva Greek. You're still muted. We cannot hear you. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. I always do that. I don't know how long it will take me to learn to not to do this. Gretchen, congratulations. Thank you so much. So many of us, current generations and future generations, will be really thankful and plowing through your I would use actually John Dillon's final description in the review that came out just a couple minutes after Federico sent his email yesterday in the BMCR review, that really called your work monumental. And by all means, what you've done is you've given us, and which actually Christina tried to, and very, very skillfully opened a black box to those of us who are studying the Greek reception and the long, long tradition of the Timaeus. From that perspective, what you have done is opened the light to the West and the Latin reception of the Timaeus. And I was very struck in the discussion, which by the question that Christina raised about the relationship between the heaven and earth. And all that I was thinking is a constant dialogue with Philo in the background. Christina's suggestion with Augustine is very, very appealing in taking that dialogue further. But I was actually thinking of the Timaeus itself and how powerful this, let me call it, Latin tradition of reading the Timaeus is, where I was struck by, I haven't read your book, but by the structure of your book, I see that you're progressing from the world soul through the creation of the natural world, God and God. So that original ontological or ontogenesis fact of the Timaeus, where the demiurge looks upon the chaos of the primary elements, and then he orders the primary elements. And the outcome of it is the intelligible design, the placement of nous and organization into the universe. Then I see a very new way that perhaps the relationship, my question to you is that relationship between nous, that is intellect, and the demiurge as by nature being good and by nature possessing intelligence, that is somehow translated into and empowered and expressed in the concept of human knowledge as episteme, as the gifts that Plato tells us Athena specifically gives to the Proto-Athenians, even before the account of the Timaeus. So the dichotomy then becomes from intelligible and intellectual understanding of the universe and human gathered knowledge. Do you see this as an attempt to bridge and explain how exactly, both empirically and scientifically, we can view the universe? Or is a very specifically, characteristically Latin tradition focusing on the logoi as characterized by human understanding? Sorry, that became too convoluted of a question.
That's all right. It's a lovely question. Thank you. I have the feeling that Federico Petrucci may want to weigh in on this because, you know, he's just been working on the Timaeus a lot himself. So, Federico, do you want to come in first on this, or?
No, please. Let's go back from late antiquity to the Timaeus itself. So, please.
Well, the way I often try to approach this, you know, and I apologize because a number of you have heard me do this now a couple of times, but I often read the Timaeus as an underdetermined text that left a lot of questions, which is precisely what the rest of the tradition then tried to solve. I mean, you know, we don't have to dwell too long on what kind of discourse it is, given the number of papers that have been written on the ecos, logos / mythos. But so the demiurge, you can say, has a noetic aspect and he has a relational aspect. So on the one hand, he looks at the intelligible realm as the model or being, and on the other hand, he's the one who imposes order on the universe. Now, you know this better as, you know this as well as anybody. It's that tension that the Platonist tradition is trying to come to terms with. And Calcilius has his own way of doing it, which is not the typical way of hypostases. But as far as human beings are concerned, what I find distinctive in Calcilius is not just like in Plato's Timaeus, you know, the function, if you look at the function of the world soul, it's a famous passage and it's a very complicated passage. The world soul has primarily a cognitive function. It pronounces sameness and difference about the intelligible and about the perceptible. And of course, it expresses the order of the universe because the heavenly bodies are located in this framework. Calcilius will also highlight the providential function of the world soul, which is, of course, happens also in other Platonist contexts, but that gets carried on to humans too. So it's not just that we have knowledge that we can gather, you know, from an environment that is now betraying traces of intelligibility, right? The copy is not just a loss of meaning. Plato here is actually interested in how you can have order in nature. But there is a providential function that gets carried over as well, not just the epistemic function. And he doesn't do it with the sort of traditional 3 levels of providence, which we find in other texts, but he clearly has a chain of providence as well. So, and that's an aspect that is also not really developed in the Timaeus.
This is indeed a very interesting point. To some extent, this spoiled one of the part of my talks. In fact, so I try to say a couple of things in this sense. And this also allows me to ask something or clarify something which I find very interesting in Gretchen's book on the Timaeus itself. While translating and studying it, I got convinced that providence is in any way, and I think Gretchen doesn't agree on this, one of the major, at the same time, major and most hidden aspects of the characterization of the demiurge himself. So I think that noetic aspect is indeed present. It is clear at some points. So the works of reasons are meaningful just because the nous is there. And this is just one of the dimensions or functions. And this is one of the reasons why I wouldn't translate, for instance, in the Timaeus, demiurge with demiurge. Just because in Italian, if I call him demiurge, it is sort of his proper name, his first name, but it is one of the descriptions of this god. So he is mainly the god or something like this. But I also think that while providence is used just once with respect to the god, one of the things which God does is to plan and to have will. So bouletheis, boulomenos, and so on. So the weird thing is that he says just once that there is a pronoia, but many times that he plans and has a certain will. And a tricky aspect with this is that pronoia becomes a technical term. But I think we shouldn't expect Plato to use it as a technical term. In this sense, I think that in Plato, the will of the demiurge is one of the most important things. By the way, Franco Ferrari doesn't agree at all with this, so we had to negotiate in our understanding, and we had very good, I mean, afternoons on this. It was very nice. And so I think that this is one of the aspects which are most important in the Timaeus itself. And I would add another thing, that is that the relationship between the God and forms in the Timaeus is really weird, just because the precosmic pan is the actual puzzle in that sense. In my reading, but I will say this, but I will not open a discussion on this, since I know it is, I mean, it's very tricky. There is, in my view, for Plato, a sort of precosmic participation of chora in forms. This is the way I would read your thing, just because it makes sense of what the demiurge does. But this is, of course, hardly acceptable for some Platonists, and for the sempiternalists. You can find another kind of explanation, and Gretchen very well explains how Calcidius describes or treats this state as to the elements. So I would say that these are probably, to my mind, the elements which are in the Timaeus, and I would agree with Gretchen 1999 especially, that in fact all this is mediated in a determining way by the Stoics. So I'd say that what really Plato said is inevitably condition. I think in this sense, the first book of the De Natura Deorum is key. I mean, what Plato said in the first century before is what Cicero ascribes to him, which is Stoicism and Platonism and so on. Or Eudorus on the other side. So I think that our background for the Timaeus should be that one, since I wonder whether they were able to go behind that. A sempiternalist of the first century BC was Eudorus reading the Academy. So the most we can do is to go up to Speusippus and Xenocrates, or something like this. Well, yes, I'm quite keen on the Timaeus in this time, so I will stop myself here, not to go beyond. I'll leave the floor to other questions, indeed, or to comments, indeed.
Are there any further comments on this? Or maybe we can...
I would have a question to Christina, for Christina and Gretchen, since they are specialists of Plato Latinus and of the translations, and this is quite a curiosity, in fact. So while doing the edition of the dialogue, and so by checking the manuscript, Greek manuscript tradition, and Cicero and Calcidius, something which so all that you both notice it in your books emerge very, very well. So on the techniques of translation and so on. And my question concerns these cases in which Calcidius explains, or paraphrases text. So in my view, it is striking that you can find in this author cases, in my view, a couple of cases in which he's better alone, also with respect to the manuscripts, of the correct reading. So a very precise testimony, and we can deduce it out of other factors. And other cases in which you find explanatory translations. Is this, I mean, one might imagine this to be a sort of inconsistent style. Would you consider it as a rather a complex style, I suppose, of translation? So a specific style which is different from respect with, I don't know, Merbeke or other translations which we consider more reliable?
I think that's one for you, Christina.
Fede, can I just double check, because your audio or mine or whatever cut out for a couple of seconds. So are you asking, is it inconsistent that Calcidius sometimes seems to give paraphrases and at other times sticks to the text very closely? Is that what you said?
Yeah, I mean, whether you would consider this kind of apparently inconsistent style of translation, so sometimes very precise and sometimes paraphrastic, inconsistent, or as being his own style. I mean, sort of codified translation style.
So I'm not sure if the two options are mutually exclusive. I think so. What Gretchen brings out so beautifully in her book is Calcidius's independence, and I think he may have used his own judgment to determine what passages may need further elucidation, especially with a view to his target audience, Hosius, whoever this guy is in the end. So I think you can, sure, I cannot say no, he's, no, look, this is very consistent and smooth and a very thought through technique. But I would simply say you know, where we get more of an exegetical translation, these are possibly the areas that he himself flagged, you know, as particularly challenging, difficult, or as opportunities to showcase his knowledge or to invite his, you know, readers with various different intellectual backgrounds. So I think I would like to put a positive spin on it and say he simply applies his own judgment, you know, in determining where his readers might need more guidance than others.
Yes, I agree.
Okay, there are no other questions. Maybe we can take a break. I would say 10 minutes, maybe. So we can, or more, we can meet again at 6:10, 10 past 6.
I would say 6.
20 past 6, sorry. Okay. Okay, we can start now with the second discussion. So please, Federico.
Thank you, Ariane, and let me start by thanking again Gretchen and Christina for agreeing to take part in this event, and again Michael Sharp and CUP for the collaboration, which has been precious indeed. And I did receive my hard copy today, but I had a chance to have a deeper look in the great piece of scholarship in the last weeks. And indeed, John Dillon's review published yesterday in Brimo was quite timely, I mean, as an introduction to our event. Although, as I will say in my short presentation, I mean, I don't agree with some of his remarks. Of course, I agree with him that this is a monumental achievement for scholarship. My talk will be especially methodological. So I think that one of the most important things Gretchen does in her book is to outline a method through which we can deal with authors such as Calcidius. And this is particularly important since in our field, there is often the risk of, let's say, analyzing authors and works just because they are transmitted. So everything which is transmitted is important as such. The risk with this is to have a sort of archaeological approach to antiquity, according to which, you know, even a shopping list might be of any interest just because it exists. And of course, many authors risk being in this kind of archaeological, on this kind of archaeological site. Or there is another risk to consider authors just because they are bearer of sources. So we study authors just because they can use them in order to have access to, in this case, Numenius or Porphyry or whatever. So these two risks are perfectly avoided by Grecian, who does something which is more straightforward and more difficult. It is to show that Calcilius was a thinker, a proper philosopher, Platonist philosopher, and of course, she also says what kind of philosopher or Platonist he was. Namely, I think I can say a middle Platonist. Not a middle Platonist drawing on Plutarch or Numenius or whatever, but a middle Platonist along with Plutarch, Numenius, Alcinous, and so on. So I think that with Grecian's substantial treatment in a monograph entirely devoted to Calcilius, we now have a new middle Platonist. It's a new profile of a middle Platonist. And the methodological moves which one can discover in this book in order to avoid these risks are, well, first saying who Calcilius was. And this is how the way in which the book starts and ends, in fact. And then by reading all the chapters and by analyzing how the contents of Calcilius' commentary, the form of Calcilius' commentary, and the sources of Calcilius' commentary are treated, we find also some sort of methodological guide of how to treat authors such as Calcilius. And I would say that this is a sort of stress test for an author. And what I would like to do today is to outline what, in my view, are the most important aspects of this stress test as a methodological paradigm. Of course, I'm not implying that all authors will resist this stress test. The test is important just because maybe you apply this test to an author and you discover that he's really just bearer of sources. In that case, however, Calcilius is revealed as a proper philosopher. So, of course, this has already emerged from Christina's talk, who has enlightened Calcilius' views on matter and some aspects of his identity. I will rather focus on a specific test case, which will be Calcilius' theology, Calcilius' theological model. Then I will get quickly to the form of Calcilius' commentary, which is pretty peculiar, in fact, to my mind. And then I will draw some general conclusions on this, from this. The reason why let me clarify this point. It is necessary to produce this stress test on Calcilius is that the destiny of Calcilius is, in this sense, quite weird, since the most beneficial author who dealt with Calcilius, who is, to my view, Watzing, producing a wonderful philological edition, was also the killer of Calcilius, because in the related writings, well, in the writings related to the edition, you find Watzing and his group saying, look, the text is very important for its reception, for its Latin, and so on. We provide you with a wonderful critical edition, but look, Calcilius wasn't clever. Calcilius wasn't intelligent. Calcilius is important almost only for the sources. And we have, in fact, these books on the sources of Calcilius, which many of us read, and probably many of us found them disappointing from that point of view, with respect to Calcilius at least. This is a destiny which, for instance, also Theonos Myrna or Sextus Empiricus underwent to some extent. So the importance of discovering a suitable method is that we will be in a position to apply this method to other authors. And the idea of writing a monograph rather than a commentary is key in this sense, because the monograph is the perfect format, in my view, to produce an overall account of the thought of these authors. So, all this to say that Gretchen achieves her goal to outline Calcilius as an authorial voice. This is the first chapter of the book. So in what does this method consist? I would say that the most important moves which are proposed in the book are focused on the internal philosophical economy. So the reader is always aware that Calcilius uses sources to some extent, but is also aware and gets progressively more aware of the fact that Calcilius has his own specific agenda. So by reading the chapters, especially of the first part, we discover that the sources are arranged within an overall structure which is specific of Calcilius, and some parts, of course, are Calcilius' own, and also the treatment, the selection, the refashioning of the sources is Calcilius. And then we have, so this is the formal analysis. And then we have an analysis of the contents. So especially the second part of the book is devoted to theoretical aspects of the commentary, a topic after topic. Each topic is related to the others, of course, but there is an internal economy and an internal narrative for each topic. So the war soul, the human soul, providence, theology, and so on. You have in this way two tracks, a methodological one or formal one, and one related to the contents. And in the end, they eventually are consistent to each other and are effective if joined to each other. And in this way, one arrives at the end of the book in such a position as to being able to deal also with the sources. Just at that point, just after we know exactly who Calcilius is and what Calcilius thought is. So all this probably will be clearer by focusing on one specific issue, that is Calcilius' theology. And this is indeed quite a controversial issue, since you have on the table many hypotheses. I would say, well, a number of hypotheses. However, no one until the last 2 years, and I'm referring also to, of course, also to Christina's treatment of Calcilius, and now with Gretchen, now we know that probably Calcilius was not a Neoplatonist, not in the sense that he was a committed Neoplatonist, neither in the sense that he simply used Porphyry. We know with Gretchen that he was, he proposes a Middle Platonist theology, but not in the sense one usually thought before these last developments in Gretchen's book. And here I would also emphasize that, if I'm right, John Dillon's in his very good review says that Calcilius draws from Numenius, while if I have it right, Gretchen says something quite different. I mean, he knows or uses Numenius, and of course his theology is a Middle Platonist theology, but it isn't Numenius theology at all. And I will get back to this point since it is quite crucial in my view. So the way in which Gretchen excludes that Porphyry is behind Calcidius' theology is philologically perfect. So just there is nothing distinctive of Porphyry in Calcidius, and on the contrary, many aspects of Calcidius' theology show that no Neoplatonist commitment can be ascribed to Calcidius. And everything Calcilius says on the theological side can be consistently read, let's say, in a Middle Platonist scenario. So to put it very briefly, there is no idea of a principle which is beyond being in the Neoplatonic meaning of this expression, for instance. But this is not, I think, the crucial point, since already John Dillon himself and other scholars said that Calcidius' theology isn't a Neoplatonist one. The point is rather that Gretchen outlines a new Middle Platonist theological model. That is a model which has broad parallels in other thinkers, as usual in Middle Platonism, but a model which in its peculiarities has no real actual parallel. So we have a new theological model. And to put it briefly, we have a tripartition of the divine with a first God and a second God, who's also called the first mind, or referred to as a first mind. And then we have the third God and second mind, or soul. And interestingly enough, Calcilius refers to the first two divinities with references to the demiurge. This is a very schematic representation, which is helpful indeed, but and this specific scheme has no actual parallel in Middle Platonism. But even more important is the fact that these three levels are dynamically related to each other. So you have a dynamic relation of powers in this divine scenario which Calcilius outlines. And Gretchen shows that, that these dynamics allow us to understand why Calcilius apparently distinguishes, sometimes in an apparently incoherent way, these divinities. The point is not that Calcilius is incoherent or inconsistent. The point is that Calcilius has, case by case, the need to describe the divine in a certain way in order to exploit some aspects or in order to satisfy some issues in his philosophical agenda. So the most of dynamism in the theology and a very nicely consistent system as a whole. Gretchen rightly says that Numenius has, as everyone knows, a tripartite theory of the divine, but this is not how Numenius' divine word works at all. I would add that, for instance, Alcinius apparently has a tripartite structure, and sometimes the dynamics within the intelligible realm can be discovered in Plutarch as well. So I think that from this point of view, Franco Ferrari's pioneer book in 1995 has a very good point. I mean, Plutarch sometimes has a very basic theology, God, forms, and so on, and sometimes just talks of the divine realm and so on. So this is a typically Middle Platonist approach, but I cannot refer to any author having this specific dynamic. This is important in itself, but I think that also in this case, the method applied by Gretchen is particularly important. Since if you read through the chapter on God, you find that some key passages are used, which are taken from different parts of the commentary. So if you assume that Calcilius is just collecting sources, and you assume that Calcilius' theology is drawn from a source, then you should find probably a single block altogether, allegedly deriving from a source. While using many different parts of the commentary, Gretchen shows implicitly that there is a single line of reasoning in behind the whole project of Calcilius. That is, that Calcilius develops his theology in different parts of the commentary, taking different points of view. So I could just list 139, 176, 9, 188, 9, and so on. So along the whole commentary, you find descriptions of the divine. Each description is focused on some specific aspects, and the whole commentary provides us with a complete representation of the theological agenda, I would say, of Calcidius himself. And this is quite important, since when one gets to the last part of the book, there is a discussion of the relationship between Numenius and Calcidius. One already knows, in my view at least, that Numenius cannot be the source of Calcidius. And not just because there is no coincidence. The point is rather different. The point is that once one have the second part read, one knows that Calcidius' overall model is entirely inconsistent with Numenius. That is, if Calcidius used, for instance, Numenius' theology, he would have produced an entirely inconsistent system for some reasons. First, in my view, but maybe I'm biased by myself, because Numenius, in my view, was a temporalist, and Calcidius is not. So, and Numenius' theology is typically temporalist in some sense, because he puts a demiurgic function also, or especially, in the lower part of the theological system, because he needs something dealing with the irrational part of the world, while Calcidius puts it in the upper part of his model. And second, because we know from the chapter on matter that Calcidius rejects the idea of an irrational soul, or evil soul, or irrational motions of matter. And this need of irrational motions or irrational soul is typical of a temporalist, since this need determines a specific theological model and so on. Calcidius then consistently deals with many interlocutors, uses Numenius, quotes Numenius for the irrational soul, for instance, but rejects his theory of matter, probably read Numenius' theology, but consistently rejected his theology in order to have a different one, which is perfectly consistent with with sempiternalism and a theory avoiding the use of an irrational soul. So all this allows the reader to see how Calcidius worked with the sources and produced his own very specific model. And I'd say this applies to all aspects of the second part of the book. So each chapter focusing on each aspect can be analyzed in this way. So there is a specific agenda one can ascribe to Calcidius as to the word soul, human soul, providence, which is a theme on which Richard focuses a lot in a very interesting way. However, I assume that if any of the participants has a curiosity about Gretchen's reading of Providence and so on, can ask her. So we'll now turn to a different aspect, that is the form in which Calcidius writes his commentary, since it is really peculiar. So I've been dealing with the form of Middle Platonist commentary, and Gretchen very effectively shows that Calcidius' commentary is a katadze themata one, so a strongly thematic one. Theoretically, this is indeed the form of Middle Platonist commentaries. However, one thing is to say that the notion of the katadze themata or thematic inspiration is at the grounds of the Middle Platonist way of commenting upon a text. And another thing is saying that Middle Platonists wrote purely katadze themata commentaries. So the former is true for certain, the latter is not. So the Middle Platonist commentaries weren't katadze themata in the strict sense. We have some writings, Plutarch's De Anima e Procreatione, Theon's Expositio, or the Questions by Plutarch, or Arpocration and so on, which were indeed katalzetemata, but they weren't commentaries. They are not named commentaries and so on. They are exegesis, it's fine, but not commentaries. While we have commentaries, and so I refer to Longinus, Taurus, Atticus, and so on, which probably were lemmatic anyway, or progressive anyway. They had a thematic inspiration, but they had the structure of a commentary. Calcilius makes then something new, which is different from Middle Platonist commentaries, stricto sensu, which is different from questions or katalzetemata writings in Middle Platonism, and which is different, of course, from Neoplatonist commentaries. There is a new form of commentary. And I leave then this question to Gretchen, that is whether, after all, Calcidius would have regarded his own writing as a specific form of Middle Platonic writings, or whether he consciously coined a new form of exegesis or commentary, and why. Anyway, these two sketches can provide, I hope, the idea of how this new Calcidius was able to produce new doctrines and new exegetical forms, and forms which are perfectly consistent with these new doctrines, and vice versa. And these are the two parts, indeed, of the stress test, which I began my short talk with. So in this stress test, we detect lines of reasoning and of argumentations having a specific philosophical economy in themselves. We find appropriate forms in which these lines of reasoning and argumentation are put. These two aspects are coherent to each other and have no clear parallels elsewhere. And this is the most important point, all these plays a fundamental role in order to achieve a specific goal. So in order to produce a single system, let's say a coherent system, I'm saying this not because I'm a specific, I'm a peculiar fan of systems, but because being systematic is, of course, the thing a Middle Platonist aimed at. So this is what a conscious and self-aware author of this age should have aimed at. All this is in order to provide some aspects, the most important ones, in my view, of the book. But at that point, I will end with a question. And it is a puzzle I had, since at the very end of the book, one arrives also to the determination of when and where did Calcidius live. And very, very effectively, Gretchen goes back to the mid-4th century. And the problem here is that Calcidius in this representation is a Middle Platonist. He uses the sources Porphyry used, so we don't have to put him after Porphyry. Also the terminus post quem is origin. We can even avoid this problem, but let's say origin, but that would allow us even to put Calcidius in the 3rd century. Now, there are some arguments justifying the presence of a Middle Platonist in the mid-4th century, and these are very, very well indicated. So, for instance, it is true that there are some thinkers who have Middle Platonist models in the 4th or after Plotinus. This is true, although it is hard to really provide them with a name, or probably they are not. They're not that good as Middle Platonists. It is true that Plutarch for instance, represents or is a case of dealing with sources which are very far in time. So the example is Plutarch criticizes Chrysippus and not, we'd say, or rarely Amaphinius, also later Stoics. This is true, but we are able to recognize a new stream of Platonism in Plutarch. So criticisms are, critical targets are far, but doctrine is recognizably new for his own age. And then there is a final tension. I think that now it has been very effectively shown that Calcidius is a good thinker, a good middle Platonist with good readings. So a well-aware middle Platonist. Is it possible that such a thinker never wants to deal with the Neoplatonists, even in order to criticize them? So this, in my view, would imply that he isn't aware of these developments, which might look contradictory with respect to the very high quality of Calcidius' philosophy. On the other hand, I see that saying that he lived in the 3rd century AD would produce tensions with the Osius affair, with linguistic aspects. And what probably if I was able to write that book, and I wonder I was, and if I arrived at the end, I wouldn't have been brave enough as to write, yes, I want Calcidius to be a middle Platonist in the age of middle Platonists. But still, this puzzle, in as soon as see how friends can be opened, and this is in fact my last my question, and I conclude by saying that this is really a great achievement. So thank you, Gretchen.
Many thanks, Federico, for your enlightening talk. So please, Gretchen, if you would like to reply.
Yes, I think we have at least 3 main issues here, but let me start with the last one. I mean, you're right, it's an absolute puzzle. And I'm sort of saying that's the first half of the 4th century. I mean, John Dillon in his review actually went back to 410. I don't, that's a puzzle that I don't know how to solve. But I know Harold Tarrant is very excited because he's got, he's been trying to argue for a while that Platonism continues to be much more varied than we often assume, but then there is also lack of evidence, right? I mean, is Calcilius the evidence or every other supporting evidence? He's tried to bring it back to Emilius, who had a strong interest in Emilius, for example, and not Porphyry. But there are the linguistic features, the kind of Latin, so there was this, I mean, although the investigation has only been done on the prefatory letter, the question of the clausuli, the metical clausuli, which, would posit something after Arnobius. But anyway, there is a big gap there, in our knowledge as well. So, but I just wanted, I mean, the Wassing thesis was so strange in many ways. He was dead set to make Calcidius late because Calcidius was a mediocre dabbler. And so any parallels between him and others must mean that he was dependent on others and not the other way around. And that's a view that he actually changed somewhat in the addition to the 2nd edition of the work, which very few people have seen, but grudgingly. And then he absolutely wanted Calcidius to be in a circle of Milan, of Ambrose and Augustine. And, those theses are just not tenable. And also the Porphyry influence is not tenable either. If we go to specific ideas that have been attributed to Porphyry, even though we know that, Marco Zambon's really important book, that there is the presence of Middle Platonist material in Porphyry, but but you can't really use that for a source because you need views that are distinctive of Porphyry to be able to attribute things to Porphyry as a source. So then let me go briefly to the form of the commentator. On the commentator, I really do think it's a unique form. I think you're right in that, Federico. And I've been racking my brain. I mean, this is a Latin commentary on a Greek text, right? So it's even different from Macrobius's commentary on the Dream of Scipio because it goes via Latin text. I mean, of course, it brings in a lot more Greek philosophy than the Dream of Scipio had. Macrobius pulls in, you know, everybody in the kitchen sink, so to speak, but it's still a commentary on the surface on a Latin text, whereas Calcidius does a Latin translation and commentary on a Greek text, a philosophical text. And so I think the unique form of the commentary comes from the purpose, namely this kind of transference, this kind of trying to make this legacy accessible to somebody whose knowledge of Greek is probably limited and whose knowledge of philosophy is also limited. Of course, you know, in the prefatory letter, he tries to wave that, brush that off. So that's why it's more thematic than the commentaries you might find in earlier Middle Platonism. But I want to say something a bit about the genesis of the project. It's a big book. I don't know if you've ever seen it, if all of you have seen Calcidius's commentary. It's a big text. It's a long text. And it's very easy, you know, not to see the wood for the trees. But for me, what was a breakthrough moment is when I started noticing that he has summary passages. So basically, you know, the method is always, he starts with a basic explanation of what he thinks Plato's view is. Then he goes to an overview of a wide range of views. And then Plato always comes out on top as having the truth and the most complete view. And then he goes back to the text in greater detail and brings that interpretation to bear. But if you then look at the summary passages, then you start seeing, you know, that he really very carefully builds on results that he, conclusions that he arrived at earlier in the commentary. But unless you notice that, I mean, it's hard to find a thread. And then finally on Numenius, yes, there's one thing that I think I tried to show is that Calcidius does allow for lower soul. It does allow for the soul that is a vital principle, but it's not an evil soul. And so you can see that there is a kind of general doxographical framework that would allow for a view like Numenius's, but that is not limited to Numenius. And I've tried to show that the framework that he puts forward early on in the commentary, very early on in the commentary, is actually his, once again. And it allows him to order the structure's material a certain way. So yes, Numenius is important. I think Numenius is more important than Porphyry, but Numenius is not, like you said, is not the determining factor. It's not that kind of source that would have completely shaped what actually Calcidius's outlook is. So even vis-a-vis Numenius, he shows considerable independence.
Many thanks, Gretchen. I don't know whether, Federico, you would like to...
I thank Gretchen for these replies. I would have a couple of curiosities and remarks, but I would open the floor for discussion and then if we have time. And yes, please, Gretchen.
One more thing. I think it is actually in Calcidius' text that Numenius is a temporalist, and that people didn't notice this, that there is a major break here between Calcidius's endorsed view and what he attributes to Numenius. Now, it's not 100% clear cut, but the language certainly seems to indicate that he has a temporal or an interventionist interventionist reading.
Yes, on this, it's particularly stimulating, and I do agree. I mean, it isn't clear at all from Proclus fragments or Eusebius fragments, but Calcilius fragments explain, well, it's not explicit, but the internal economy of Numenius' philosophy as represented by Calcidius is that of a temporalist, in my view. Well, I suspect might be that after all, the inspiration Calcilius might have got from Numenius is that of a polemic. So how things shouldn't work, since you find a triadic theology which is not that of Numenius, but is antinomian to some extent. I mean, it works differently, and you don't have the evil soul. So this is not a source. This is an interlocutor, just as Plutarch was an interlocutor for Taurus, or Taurus for Atticus, and so on. This is the level of the debate.
But he's an important interlocutor. Yeah, he's an interlocutor that Calcidius takes seriously.
Are there any further comment on this or other question in general on the book and on these topics? If so, please raise your hand. Christina, please.
I just have an observation. Well, it's really a question to everyone. So, Fede, your comments made me just think back to, to Lessing and I remember that I spent some time debating with myself as the PhD students whether or not I should pursue Calcidius, because I thought that there was a lack of respect for him. I don't know. Maybe I'm remembering this in too dramatic terms. But the studies of Calcidius were very few. Anna Somfeisman was one of the very few ones that actually approached him as a thinker to be taken seriously. I wonder why do you think it is? Why were we having such a hard time to approach with respect that which we cannot immediately categorize? Why has he been met with so much suspicion? Why would one be interested in pushing him to the margins rather than saying, oh, this is a very exotic thing here, let's dissect it? So I just know I'm not sure. This is just a general comment. Another thing I wanted to raise perhaps is the issue of language. That Calcidius, John reckons he was a Greek, so Latin is not his own language. So I wonder if that somehow contributed to the way in which people perceived him. Because I remember myself when I first moved to the United Kingdom, I had read Jane Austen, so I had a really weird mix of a strange wannabe Welsh accent, and late 18th century English. And, I probably sounded like an idiot. So that's why I think maybe the language issue is one that should get more attention, and that may have contributed to the way in which he has been received.
Well, the exception to this trend was Van Winden. And Van Winden's study came out before the edition. And you can tell that Van Winden and Wassink didn't agree on everything. Van Winden was sort of much more skeptical about porphyry, whatever. But I think, they all came out of the Wassink camp, so they had to conform in some way. It's tricky because I think, well, what I want to say next is tricky because I think Quellenforschung, so-called Quellenforschung, has had too much of a negative press in recent scholarship. But it was very much the era of Quellenforschung, which meant that they were always hunting for parallels. And I think it's the very hunt for parallels which obscured the coherence of the text. And it was often done on the basis of terminology or whatever. And you know, so they were, if you read Wassing's introduction, you know, you really scratch your head because it goes after source of parallels. But the parallels are so tenuous in a way. But that's just the mode in which they operated. And I think it's that mode in which they operated. It sort of became, it sort of confirmed the prejudice, right? I mean, which was kind of a chicken or the egg question, sort of, you know, this is just bits and pieces of other authors. And then you have the Quellenforschung that is carried out in that vein that then confirms that this is sort of just, you know, a collage of things that are put together. So I think they were to some extent a victim of their method. Now I'm saying this because we owe an incredible debt to Quellenforschung, you know. They're the people who did a lot of the groundwork. I mean, it's easy for us now to say, well, this parallel doesn't really work and that parallel doesn't really work because they collected all that remarkable information. So I'm sometimes worried that we're a little bit, you know, again, especially in the Anglo-American circles, a little bit too disrespectful of that methodology. But that, I think, is what happens. You know, it was all one school. It was very much on the Wassing's wing. And then they were so much into this method of Quellenforschung that that's just what you did. And it ended up indirectly confirming this image. Now, I must say, I'm still scratching my head over the fact that, you know, I myself don't understand why a monograph wasn't written sooner. And I think part of the answer here is that the text defies the boundaries of academic disciplines. You know, it's not really Roman philosophy because, as you just pointed out, Christina, you know, his dominant culture is clearly Greek, and the text is full of Grecicisms, you know, things that make sense in Greek, but not really in Latin. So that's, by the way, the reason why I don't put him in the so-called Latin West. Certainly, you know, there was this label, Christian Latin West, Neoplatonism. Well, you know, Calcilius doesn't belong in any of these categories in his own right. But it's just, I mean, think of your own background, which made it possible for you to work, you know, on this translation, the kind of disciplines that came together in your background. And, you know, I basically also had to delve into the Christian tradition to be able to see what kind of voice this is. So, like, let's say you've written a book on this. Do you apply for a job in Greek? Do you apply for a job in Latin? Do you see what I'm saying? It's like, it just fell between the cracks. And even though there has been such a surge in the interest in commentary, which is the other really surprising thing, but I think just a number of things needed to come together. And that's, again, I think the collective effort of scholars, which is not nearly emphasized enough, which I think is something I say in the introduction. First, we started to pay more attention to commentaries in general, philosophical commentaries. Our understanding of Middle Platonism has made tremendous progress. And then our understanding about the relationship between Christianity and philosophy. I mean, those three things really had to come together, you know, for the monograph to happen. But it's like, what more material are we missing because of the way the cake is being cut in academic settings?
If I may add a remark on this, I mean, I entirely agree with Gretchen, and related to the issue of the job market. I mean, this is a bet. So studying Calcidius or authors such as Calcilius is a bet. I mean, you start studying them, it takes a long time, hard work, and until you are at the end, you don't know whether you are really, Calcilius has really passed the stress test. So at the end, you might even have 2 lines saying, look, Wassing was right, unfortunately, just build of sources. fortunately, we have something very different, but of course, it is very painful. I would say, I am thinking, in fact, to my Thernos Mirna, another author who received almost no treatment, and I mean, I'm wondering whether a possible future book on Thernos Mirna will not be, well, look, just sources, but anyway, it is something which deserves inquiry, and also the market issue is fundamental, and the authority issue. Bassing, I think, destroyed the field in this sense. It was too authoritative. Something similar happened with the Albinus-Alcinus affair. Oh, we had to wait until we put together a great critical edition in order to go beyond this commonplace. These are things which happen in our field, in fact, until someone quite brave decides to overwhelm the evidences. So, please.
Please, Julia.
Hi. Thank you very much. I'm learning a lot from your presentations, discussions, answers. So thank you in the first place. I was wondering, now that we restore the Calcidius authorial voice as an original thinker, and that we realize how he has his own definite views, how should we address him now when we need to deal with him as a source? So should we be much warier, or like how much does his own voice impacts the reliability of the reports when of material from other authors when this material can actually be identified?
You know, that's a great question, Julia. Now, we all know this in theory, that context matters for quotes, but you really have to be very careful with Calcidius. So I'll give one example, which I also use in the introduction of the book. There was quite a bit to do for a while. It generated a string of papers that Calcidius may have presented or preserved a different view of the structure of the human soul than we find in, in our other Stoic sources. And, a string of papers were written about this. And even Timaeus, but, great work, but sort of got pulled into that. His work on Chrysippus is absolutely first rate, but he got lured a little bit by Calcidius, because then again, if you look at the structure of the doxography and his wording, you can see that he himself inserted elements that allowed him, in view of the overall framework, and that allowed him to harmonize to some extent the different views or make them comparable. And those are Calcidius's interventions. So yes, in this case, because this is an example of thinking with doxography. So he really uses these doxographies and presents the material in light of where he wants to go with the view that he eventually wants to attribute to Plato. And for that to happen, they have to be harmonized to some extent to even create a basis of comparison. And that's very different from if you read Diogenes Laertius on Zeno, where you go through, well, they say this on this, it's a much more schematic overview. And we have much more schematic doxographies. That's why I called Calcidius' doxographies, smart doxographies. They tend to combine a number of issues. They're not simply lemmatic. They tend to combine a number of issues. The one on the human soul, again, is a wonderful example where he's combining a view of matter with the location of the ruling part of the soul. And that means, and also it's for the relation from the soul to corporality. I mean, that's what he starts out with. That's already combining a number of debates right from the get-go. So I would say with Calcidius, you have to be very careful. You have to be aware of the summary passages. You have to be aware of where he's going. And so the way we've been using him up until now as some kind of stone quarry is just, again, people keep saying he's using Origen, therefore he must be Christian. But he's using Origen in a section, in an argument that he ends up rejecting So he's aware of Origen. He quotes him, but it's a view of matter that he does not accept. I mean, you know.
Thanks.
Please, Anna Sonfai.
Yeah, I probably should say serious things, but I'm just kind of responding to Christina. I remember when I was working on my PhD on Calcidius and on the Timaeus, and I didn't have doubts in my mind. I just went ahead. I couldn't care less about what anyone said, and I didn't pay much attention to the sources, honestly. But one of the things I remember is that when I started to publish, John Dillon wrote a review of one of my articles, and he said that he thought I was right in my interpretation. However, he thought that Calcidius himself would have thought that I was kind of having too much of I was making too much of him, and he would have thought, oh no, really not, I'm not quite that smart. And it kind of stayed with me because I think that was kind of the general view, really. And I want to chime in with the commentary discussion in that I think we have a fundamental error in considering commentaries as secondary and things that have no value of its own, of their own, that they are just going on about some topic that's mentioned someplace. And I think that has to be somehow rectified, because I think some of the most intriguing thoughts are to be found in commentaries. And those of you who know my work, I work on medieval manuscripts as well and anonymous glosses. And it's a gold mine. And there are no authors and no one cares because it's not famous and so on and so forth. And I think we should at least try to get rid of our own totally maybe justifiable, but somewhat ridiculous preoccupation with fame and that sort of stuff, because thought is not attached to names, it's attached to our brain and or comes from it. And there are very interesting things said anonymously in the margins of medieval manuscripts. And at a larger or higher level, commentaries are very interesting, and to simply rule them out because they are not essays or books in the way in which we think of them, that's not useful, I think. So ultimately, I think it's time that we commit to a more serious study of these sources, because we can gain a lot by allowing them to speak to us rather than try to analyze them into bits and pieces and saying, oh, this sentence comes from here. I know I'm really bad, and as someone who teaches, I have to remind myself that I have to tell my students, yeah, of course, look at the sources. But on the whole, a writing is a piece of work and should be looked at it as such. And so basically that's what I want to say in response to the discussion, and to Christina as well. And I have very fond memories of my PhD and the way in which one at that point can really just jump into things. And so yeah, thanks.
Anna, I don't know if you remember this, but Anna Sonfai and I met in Paris, and we had a cup of coffee in front of the Sorbonne. And I think that your work was also what encouraged me to keep going, right? Because you were doing exactly that. You were looking across the commentary. You also questioned the Christian identity. You were one of the early people who raised questions next to the Christian identity. So, I miss what I was saying earlier. I mean, you can sort of pass the baton, and we don't always see that, but sometimes scholars really do end up creating a kind of collaborative effect. On your other comment, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I make deliberately provocative titles, although people don't necessarily notice that they're provocative, but thinking in doxography, right? I call it philosophy. And it's the same with what you said about the glosses. Why can't we simply look at this as a world of ideas and how the ideas are related to one another and how ideas are put forward? So yeah, I couldn't agree more. Thinking in commentary, thinking in doxography, you know, I regularly coin titles like that, whether anybody notices or not.
Federico Volpe, please.
Thank you both speakers for the exposition. I have a question about Numenius and the temporalist view you expressed. So, first of all, I would like to say that I agree that Numenius was temporalist, but during my studies, I am trying to understand better what are the reasons behind this conception. In my mind, there is only one passage that really justifies a temporalist conception of a Numenius, and is in fragment 16, where Numenius says that the damage creates cosmos, and then epeta theoreticos holos. So, and then he becomes totally contemplative. So, with respect to the fragment 52 of the Plus edition, which comes from Calcidius' commentary on Timaeus, there is the Numenius describes, so Calcidius describes this interaction by Numenius, this interaction between monads and the matter. So I don't know if it's if my view is correct, but do you think that we can imagine that also Numenius endorses a sort of a pre-cosmic action of the God, and then we have not more, we don't have two principles then, but we have the first, the second, and the third God, as Proclus says in his commentary on Timaeus. I don't know if my question is clear.
I'm going to grab the text, which might be helpful in this case. So maybe Federico, you wanna?
I think, while we're waiting for Gretchen, I have no clear idea. I must confess, there is a conference in Tübingen in which I will give a talk when we will be in presence again, so next year probably, on this. So I still have to produce an argument. It seems to me that the evidence in Calcidius is decisive. I think that there is no decisive evidence against Numenius temporalism. But above all, and this is my strongest point on this, well, you also have some fragments in which he uses the Gignomaian Genesis in a way which one might consider as temporalist. But above all, and this is my actual point, Numenius' overall metaphysical system works if he's a temporalist. If he's a sempiternalist, it doesn't work. It would turn out to be a very poor metaphysical system. I'm not assuming he was particularly intelligent. I'm applying a principle of charity. So if we can do the most of his fragments, we should. And this is the reason why I think that temporalism should be ascribed to Numenius. Apart from the overall role I would ascribe to Numenius in Middle Platonism, but this has to do with my biases, so I would leave this aside. Anyway, I would say that Calcidius' texts are fundamental in this sense.
And if you look at the Numenius passages, I mean, I pointed out in the book, basically the view is that ungenerated matter with disorderly motion precedes the ordering influence of the demiurge. And there is language of before and after there. And there is no indication, as we find elsewhere in the commentary, that it's meant to be interpreted in a non-temporal sense. So it says explicitly that it's the non-ordered matter that is eternal, right? So there is a contrast implied there, I think, which points to the temporalist interpretation. But your question and something Federico said earlier is really, really important. And there is this, it seems that there is this, again, an unresolved issue in the Timaeus. So being and becoming, you know, Timaeus starts by distinguishing being and becoming as two fundamental systems of the world, but ultimately all becoming is dependent on being. And if you think that through, then we get where what Federico earlier said, that if there is pre-cosmic something, whatever it is, that already has to indicate some minimal participation in being, but without the ordering influence of the demiurge. So on that reading, there is already in the pre-cosmic stage some minimal participation in becoming. And then what all the demiurge does is in fact strengthen the tie between being and becoming, right? But there is already a minimal, but that minimal, on that reading of the Timaeus, that minimal reflection or connection with being, call it whatever you want, does not require agency. That's a given. And I take it that in a Hoenig system, the way Calcilius presents it, it's a given, it's eternal, it's just always there.
Thank you.
Yeah, differently, but that's how I take it.
And if I entirely agree with Gretchen, I even add that, of course, it's being and becoming, or being and generation. And since Genesis, in fact, is this weird semantic, and when you are at 52D or something, there is Genesis even before. So that passage is very weird, and what is really pre-cosmic generation is hard to understand, but these people read these passages as well. So just the reference to becoming as eternal doesn't ensure that they are sempiternalis. There's something more we need.
Are there any other questions? In fact, I have a question myself. I was wondering how would you assess in general Calcidius' relationship with the Stoics? Because on the one hand, you have highlighted how deep is the Stoic influence on Calcidius' thought, but on the other side, there are some passages where you say that when reporting the Stoic view, somehow his criticism is even harsh, and he takes to the extreme their view sometimes, for example, on the soul. So I was wondering, how would you assess in general his attitudes?
Yeah, it's a much more complex hermeneutical stance than the attitude towards Aristotle, you know. So, you know, it's really Calcilius. This seems backwards, but it's Calcilius who put me on the track of seeing that we couldn't take the polemical debates or the polemical criticism of the Stoics at face value in Middle Platonism. That really the Stoics are the other that is sometimes too close for comfort, or that, you know, they provide answers that are very attractive after all, and that we really would like to be able to integrate into the Platonic worldview. And what happens in Middle Platonism is that, you know, once you get a clearly defined hierarchy of reality, you can sort of subsume Stoicism when you're talking about nature, when you're talking about the dynamic, but then it's nicely contained and, you know, it's like boxed in and it stays there. And that's not the case in Middle Platonism. I mean, it's, so I once had this argument about, what was it? subordinating. I had a big argument with Mauro Bonazzi about this, and some of it is in publication. The subordinating borrowing of Stoic elements. It's not always subordinated, you know. It's not easy to contain, and I think it goes back to something that Federico said earlier also, is that from Cicero onwards, well, I think it goes back earlier, but you find it very clearly stated in Cicero's De Natura Deorum, the Stoics and the Timaeus are lumped together. They're read together. Now, of course, we're there possibly under the influence of Antiochus of Ascalon, who may not have considered some borrowings of Stoicism problematic, but we know Cicero's own attitude to Antiochus is very, very mixed, and especially when, you know, he criticizes him for the Stoic borrowings. So the short answer is, I think you should not take the polemical passages at face value, that the presence of Stoicism is a lot stronger than we might be led to believe. And that's because it's the other that is too close for comfort, right? I mean, there are things about Stoicism that they find really abhorrent, but there are other aspects that they find really, really attractive. One of which is precisely to have a providence / fate that encompasses everything, but then you don't want to undermine human freedom, but that very notion to have something, you know, that just encompasses everything. But anyway, that's just one example.
Many thanks. Are there other questions? Or Clelia Crialesi, please.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
So many thanks to the organizers and the speakers for this insightful and inspiring discussion. I have a question related concerning the thematic nature of Calcidius's commentary, as well as his method of commenting on and deepening the contents of the Timaeus. I was just thinking at the way Calcidius himself describes his own aim in the prefatory letter to Osius, as well as the very beginning of his commentary. Calcidius states that he will try to clarify the contents of the Timaeus using the very specific tools of each scientific discipline. He calls these tools artificiosa ratio. And now I can easily identify this approach when Calcidius deals with, for instance, the generation of the world soul. He explicitly refers to music theory, but I was wondering, is there still an artificiosa ratio by means of which Calcidius comments on the silva, for instance, the matter?
So I think the answer, it's a very good question. The answer to that has already been alluded to briefly. So it comes fairly late in the commentary. I forget now exactly where, but I think Calcilius shows his hand when he talks about a view of theoretical philosophy that consists of mathematics, physics, and then theology. But, you know, theology is the discipline that deals with the first principles. So, you know, it's maybe what we might want to call ontology nowadays. And so in that sense, the artificiosa ratio is limited to the first part of the commentary, to the mathematics. Now, what is not insignificant here is that for Calcidius, the order is mathematics, physics, theology. In other words, for him, these are the, if you want, propedeutic disciplines, the things one needs to understand in order to understand what Plato is talking about. But it's not mathematics in the sense that we find it in many Neoplatonist contexts, where mathematics is an ideal vehicle to build a bridge between the sensible and the intelligible realm. Not that notion of mathematics. And if anything, when Calcilius, I mean, I noticed this when Calcilius talks about the mathematical structure that pertains to the world soul, or the world body, or the world soul, he always uses language of according to, you know, there is no theory. Well, he talks a little bit about the origin of the numbers at some point in the text, but it doesn't really affect his overall discourse. So he doesn't really give us much about the ontological status of mathematicals in their own right, which was a really, really important aspect of Neoplatonism. Well, it goes back to Plato himself, of course. So in that sense, the artificiosa ratio gets left behind. And of course, when physics is meaning the study of nature, but if you look even at the topics that Calcilius lists under physics, even those occur in that section, you know, like the prominence of providence, for example. It's a topic that is also mentioned by Calcilius. So, and what is interesting, but we might know this already, is at the very end of the text, he does return to the notion of the artificiosa ratio, and says, you know, that it's that passage in the Timaeus right before the demiurge will impose the mathematical order on the elements. And so their mathematics will come back in. But of course, we don't have that part of the commentary because the commentary stops there. But it allows Calcilius again to restate the point that the interlocutors in the dialogue, of course, were up to speed, that they knew that this mathematics inside out. So in the short answer is that for Calcilius, mathematics is like a basic form of knowledge that you need to enter the text, but it doesn't necessarily carry through all the way to the commentary.
Christina, please.
I wanted to say I have to run off for a few minutes, and if I don't come back before you finish, I just wanted to say thank you so much, Gretchen and Fede and Arianna and Julia, everybody here. This has been so enjoyable, and I hope I catch you again.
Christina, thank you very much again for your very stimulating talk.
Yeah, thank you so much, Christina. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Christina. Thank you.
Are there, please, Sebastiano Moro.
Yes, I have a question about the relationship between these disciplines, the mathematics, physics, and theology, because I remember reading once Dante's Convivio, and it intrigued me that he makes this order of disciplines corresponding to planets, the liberal arts with the planets, and the physics and metaphysics with the heaven of fixed stars, and then theology. So in this example, it looks closer to this order of the elevation or ascent through the spheres, and physics and theology, and the liberal arts with the planets and mathematics below physics. But the other normal Neoplatonic way will be to put first physics, then mathematics in the middle. And I was thinking if it's related to this Latin Platonism, also with maybe Calcidius and Martianus Capella.
Well, you know that Edward Junot calls Calcidius, he tried, Junot really tried to keep this text on the map, called Calcilius one of the four master texts of antiquity, together with Martianus Capella. So
and is there any reference to this correspondence between cosmic and disciplines?
No, not that I can see. No, that correspondence is not in Calcidius, no.
Thank you.
You're all probably getting tired, but if I want to ask Federico a question, I mean, again, you know, he and I have been going back and forth about this, but I can't resist the opportunity. So, Federico, what I would say to you here is that in Calcidius, we have a sempiternalist view of the world, with still a very strong demiurgic function, even though it is not interventionist. In that sense, he's a bit of a challenge too, right? He's a bit of an oddity too.
Well, while reading the book, I asked myself this question. It is indeed a very huge question. My point is, would be that the theological structure you draw, so with demiurge, which is anyway in the first two levels of the divine, and then mediated by a war soul, would, to my mind, square well with sempiternalism. Of course, it isn't a peripatetic. I do agree. But you have anyway a mediation of providence, for instance. So you don't have the direct action of Atticus, or you don't have the weird way in which Plutarch says that a part of God himself, is within the soul and through the soul, hegemonei, the word. You have anyway a mediation, and it seems to me that this mediation is a sort of, which is reflected, mirrored in providence. You have these multiple levels. This might square with. The reason why I see the negative influence, let's say, of Numenius as a target is that it seems to me that Calcilius might have reasoned in the terms of producing a sempiternalist antinomenian model, or a model especially replying to Numenius, if we assume that Numenius was an important source. But it seems to me that the fact that in Numenius you have the demiurges below, and the first god is preserved as autoagaton and so on. Well, here you have the demiurge as and his first mind on the upper side, and then you have the war soul mediating providence, might or can, I'm not certain of, represent a good model of the other side, let's say. In fact, my point is, I would very much want Calcidius to be with Alcinous, since these are two expressions of the late sempiternalism, Middle Platonism. On the other hand, I must say that we take as said Calcinius lived, I mean, just before Plotinus, but just because he assumed that if he lived after Plotinus, he would have quoted him. But this is not necessary. So no one can exclude that Alcinous lived in the 4th, 5th century, in fact. So also on this side, there are puzzles. But well, I think one could explain with the theological model, Calcilius' theological model in a sempiternalistic way, without regarding him as with interventionalist God.
Yeah, I think he's more of a nuanced case than that, Federico. I agree with you that if it's a spectrum, he would go more to the side of Alcinous, but you don't get this language of any reminiscences of an unmoved mover in Calcidius. And, you know, one of the strange things is that the second God is called the will or the mind of the first, right? How on earth are we supposed to...
I'm not saying that it's the same model. I would say put together at the chronological level. Yeah. No, I don't see close parallels, just as a way of, and of course he's much less Aristotelian than...
Yeah. And then the very fact that the demiurge, I would say that my interpretation of Calcilius is that the demiurgic function has been split between the world soul and his first God. I mean, you could sort of say the noetic side goes to the first God, and the relational side goes to the world soul. So in that sense, I disagree with Donini. I really do think that some aspects of the demiurgic function have, that it's not limited exclusively to the world soul. But Calcidius, like you pointed out, the demiurge is the first and the second God together, right? So it's very strange actually trying to envisage this, to really think it through fully. So, but that also pushes the demiurge up a little bit on the ontological ladder, rather than pushing it down. And you're right, of course, there is a chain of providence, but you don't get to simple threefold providence. So yeah, but to me, it was very struck by, it's a sempiternalist view that at the same time really, really wants to emphasize the demiurge and keep the demiurge in the picture as the divinity that is responsible for the order. And that demiurge is not described in peripatetic terms.
But I think this is the challenge of sempiternalists. I mean, when they start, they have Plutarch, and they have to side against Plutarch, and you have strong use of peripatetic materials, I'd say. Then you have much more refined models in Alcinous, for instance. But the problem for a sempiternalist is to have providence, being a Platonist, to use the demiurge, but to have mediations which avoid the accusation of being too Stoics. So this is their mediation, while in my view at least, Atticus has no worry with the accusation of being a Stoic, just because he says, look, I can be a Stoic, but my God is not material, I have forms, and so on. And so I say that this is the challenge, in fact, which one can recognize also in Calcidius' sempiternalism, which solutions which are quite different with respect to Apuleius, Alcinous, and so on.
Right, but you could argue then that the demiurgic language underscores the thickness of the causality, right? That it really is the cause of the order of the world, even though there is mediation. So that's what I think the demiurgic language does too in Calcidius. So that it's not because there's no temporal sequence that doesn't make the involvement of the God weaker. So it's transferred. The strength of the involvement is strength to the causal dimension rather than the temporal one. But you are right that they have to come to terms with that challenge. And in fact, you see Calcilius pushing back against the Stoic view just when you think that he might have, there is this one passage when he describes matter, where he describes the relationship between God and matter completely in Stoic terms. He talks, God permeates all of reality. God shapes reality through and through. And you go, wait, what? As a Platonist, you start to tremble in your boots. But in that passage, it's actually in the introduction to the Treatise on Matter, he juxtaposes an Aristotelian analysis with his extremely Stoic sounding language. So, and sometimes what happens is, I think, and this is really my view on Maximus of Tyre too, that it leads to unresolved tensions. You have both. And sometimes they juxtapose these points of view. You go like, how can you have it both ways exactly?
I would agree. I'm not particularly keen in the language at this point of the tradition. I mean, since I find it very puzzling for a Platonist. I mean, a Platonist has, at this point of the tradition, a sort of traditional language. So he has to use some words. And it is even more puzzling since in the Timaeus, you find indeed words which will become technical in the Stoa. So the hegemoneoin is in the Timaeus. but then it will be typical in the Stoics. So if they quote the Timaeus or refer to the Timaeus, automatically they look like Stoicizing Platonists and so on. This is, or Demiurge, of course. So Demiurgen, Demiurgusa, and so on. However, in fact, you find Demiurgeon and Demiurgusa also in Plotinus, for instance, where you have, however, an anti, or at least in my reading or in other scholars' reading, an anti-artificialist conception of generation. So this is my worry in this case. Another aspect which is specific of Calcidius, this is among the questions I had, is one can avoid the question of Christianity or Christianism. One can avoid, one has to avoid it for reasons you very well explain in your book. But in the end, if he knows that there is the Christian totem, etc., then his theory must resist also to Christian accusations, for instance. And on providence or divine activity, these are very strong. So for instance, we have Origenes' criticisms against Platonists looking at Stoics. So this must be a worry. And if I were Calcidius, I would have been quite scary on writing anything on providence as a Platonist and not a committed Christian, and trying to manage with all these instances. I would say that it would be much more tempting to be a Neoplatonist at this point, just because Plotinus is able to entirely shift within a new paradigm and avoid all these tensions. Well,
exactly, but that's exactly what I've been saying too, is that in these other forms of Platonism, the tensions are not resolved, and that, you know, Neoplatonism is one way to solve it, is to solve the problem. You know, I think you and I have probably taken this little debate between ourselves far enough, because we might start losing people at this point. But
okay. Arianna?
Yeah, so let me thank again Federico, Christina, I don't know if she's still with us, and Gretchen for the very rich discussion. So I remind you that next week we will have another presentation on Christian Platonism, so another books, and I invite you to register for it. And thank you very much to
let me just
everyone.
take a moment to express my deep gratitude for having organized this event, because, you know, often as scholars we feel like, you know, we talk to the walls, or it's our face on our computer, but to see one's work taken up in a discussion like this is really the most beautiful reward one can have as a scholar. So thank you very, very much.
Very much welcome, Gretchen. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah.
And bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.